what we were doing.
At this point, we've learned to use a number of really cool tools in React like state and props. Now we get to start using those tools in creative ways and putting them together. Your challenge here is honestly pretty contrived. I can't think of a reason why you would actually want to do this, but for the sake of practice, I want you to create a new component named count, which will essentially replace these 3 lines of code. In other words, you'll create a new component named count, it will render this div with this h1, and in an effort to practice props, we're going to pass that new count component a prop that we'll just generically call number. The value of that prop number should be the value of our current count. I promise this isn't just busy work. We are building toward a point. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. We'll render a component out up there. Now I need to create that file and work over there. So I'm going to create count.js. Because I'm going to use that number. Before this was referencing the state, and I'm just going to paste that div that I had before. Looking through props, so I can say props dot, and it's not props dot. I mentioned this is pre-contrived, so it was called number. Props.number. I'll hit refresh, and you can see everything is working exactly the way it was before. Now, as I mentioned, this is pre-contrived. I can't imagine why you would care to put a count component in its own component that just displays a number, especially when it's only 3 lines of code, unless for some reason you were going to be reusing this component in different contexts around your application. Let me clean up this challenge, and then we'll talk about why I had to do this. As I mentioned, we've learned how to use props for a component to be able to receive values like we've done here, and we've learned state and how to have a component declare its own values that are intended to change and update the user interface when those changes happen. And now all we're doing is we're combining those 2 concepts. We are still initiating state inside of our app component, but then we're passing that state value down to a separate component called count, and it's receiving that value as props. Now we're going to see something cool that React does. Let me, inside of my app component, console log app component rendered. Anytime React creates an instance of our app component, which is happening here in index.js, it will run this function, and part of that function will console log app component rendered. Then we'll go ahead and do the exact same thing in the count component. And we'll change this to count component rendered. Now, before I hit refresh, as a reminder, the word rendered simply means that it placed the elements that React knew it needed to place on the screen. So when I say app component rendered, it means that it took the markup of our app component and it painted it to the screen, or it placed it on the screen, it created the DOM elements and the styles that it needed for it to display correctly on the screen. And you can see there's a sort of cascading effect here. Over in index.js, we render an app component. When we go to app, we see that it renders a count component, and it's doing that down the line. So it will first say app component rendered. I'll open the console and hit refresh. We see app component rendered and count component rendered. Now there's a really cool thing that React does for us, and that is whenever state changes, it will re-render the component where the state exists and any child components that may rely on state to be working correctly. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If I'm going to change my state from 0 to 1, I'm going to need my component here to re-render, which will then cause this count component to re-render, and it will pass the new value of count. And that way it can very quickly and seamlessly update what I see on the page just by re-rendering those components. We're not going to dive deep at this point into understanding exactly how React is re-rendering, which components it's re-rendering, and optimizing which components it's re-rendering. That's a topic for a more advanced course. But for now, it's a good experiment to have these console logs here and see that every single time we change our state, it's re-rendering the component in which the state is declared, and any children components like our count component here that may or may not depend on the state value for count. Awesome. Now we've seen an example of a child component receiving a state value via props. Now we'll look at how a child component might be given access to make changes to its parent's state. Okay, here we are back at our little contact card with the favorite icon. Your challenge to start us off is to move the little star image, just this one little image element, into its own component, and maybe we'll just call it star. That'll be the name of the component. And it should receive a prop called isFilled that the star component will use to determine whether the icon should display the filled PNG or the empty PNG. Then inside of this component here, you'll need to import and render the new star component, and make sure to pass the correct value of isFavorite, our contact.isFavorite, to that isFilled prop. At this point, it's not going to work the way it was before, where we could click it and flip it on and off. For now, in order to test it, you can simply change this value from false to true, and it should, if it's working correctly, display the filled in star when you change that to true. There's a few different moving pieces here, so this is a slightly more difficult challenge than the ones we've done up until now, but I know you'll be able to do it. Pause the screencast now and start working on this challenge.
What do we have to do exactly? Move the star image into its own component. Okay. Create a new component. That means we have to create a new file. Or let's just watch it.
Once again, I think I'll work backwards. I'm going to cut this image out, and I will render a star component, which I have not yet created. I'll give it this isFilled prop. That will be the value of contact.isFavorite. Let's import this, and then we'll go and create it. So I'll import star from /star. Then I'll create that file star.js. Okay, and in this case, I need to make sure that I'm receiving props because I will need them. I'm going to return, and then this image element. I'm going to get to this onClick in just a second, but for now, let's figure out our star icon. I'm going to just set star icon. I have access to our contact state because we're not going to go take exactly what I had here and then make a slight change. Okay, now we don't have access to our contact state because we're not passing it down. However, we do have a replacement isFilled, and that's part of props, so it's props.isFilled. And then this will determine which image should be used. Let me remove my onClick so I don't get an error. We'll hit refresh and see if we missed anything. Okay, awesome. Now my star is empty, and that's because this value is false. Let's test this by changing it to true, and the star is filled. Awesome. And at this point, I can remove this line because I'm not needing that anymore. And at this point, that leads us to the topic of the screencast, and that is how do I make it so that I can change this value? Clicking it is not doing anything. The conundrum that we have is that we have a child component that's receiving the value of isFavorite through props, but it is not receiving the ability to change that state. So think for a second, how can I give my child component the ability to make changes to
Give it a function as a prop, maybe?
To the state that lives inside the parent component, which is app. In fact, I want you to pause and try to think through a solution to this. You don't actually have to type it and try it out, but just try to think, how could I give my child component the ability to make changes to the state that lives in the parent? One thing that can be tricky when you're first learning React is the thought that you can just add a click event listener on your star component. So what if I just said onClick equals toggle favorite? Let me hit refresh and click this, and you'll see, well, it's not quite working. Why do you think that this isn't enough for this to work? Remember, when we have a component that we created, a custom component that we created, all of the properties that we pass it are custom properties. So simply putting onClick here doesn't magically register it as an event listener. The onClick attribute needs to exist on native DOM elements like these ones that begin with lowercase letters. That's because these are what will actually get created into real DOM elements by React. However, star with a capital S is not quite working. Why do you think that this isn't enough for this to work?
Why is it not enough? Oh no. So this is probably not an HTML component. It's a custom component, right? So that is the reason. I don't know.
Remember, when we have a component that we created, a custom component that we created, all of the properties that we pass it are custom properties. So simply putting onClick here doesn't magically register it as an event listener. The onClick attribute needs to exist on native DOM elements like these ones that begin with lowercase letters.
Okay, makes sense, but that means onClick has no literal meaning.
That's because these are what will actually get created into real DOM elements by React. However, star with a capital S is not a real DOM element. Instead, what's happening is React is looking at the star component and it's rendering this image. This image has the ability to receive an onClick event listener. So what I could do is still pass onClick here, but realize that onClick is just a custom prop that happens to be called the same name as the event listener. In fact, is still pass onClick here, but realize that onClick is just a custom prop that happens to be called the same name as the event listener. In fact, oftentimes this will be changed to handleClick just to make it very obvious that it's not a native event listener. And then over in our star component, I can add a real onClick event listener and say the value of this onClick will be the function that comes from props.handleClick. In this case, my app component is passing this toggle favorite function to a child component and allowing that child component to run it whenever a certain event like the click event happens. However, it's important to note that the context in which the toggle favorite function exists is still here in the parent, which means that it can change the state that lives inside the parent. Let's hit refresh, we'll click our star, and we see that we're back to working the way we thought. So as a recap, we created our toggle favorite function, we passed it to our custom component in a custom prop called handleClick, and then over in the star component, it's receiving props, and it's registering a real event listener onClick, whose functional value is the function that we received through props.handleClick. The ability to pass registering we passed it to our custom component in a custom prop called handleClick, and then over in the star component, it's receiving props, and it's registering a real event listener onClick, whose functional value is the function that we received through props.handleClick. The ability to pass state setter functions like this one down to children components is especially crucial in React. And that's due to the fact that the way that React's hierarchy is set up when it passes data. And this is what we're going to talk about in the next lesson.
When does... So we don't even require Redux, I guess. Ever? Or maybe.
At this point, I think it's worth taking a high-level look at how data is passed from one component to another in React. Let's imagine we have a fairly simple app which has the following components, just represented by rectangles for now. In this tree, this top component represents a top-level component, for example, our app component in a system set up like this. And the lines indicate that this top component is rendering these other components. In some cases, that component may just render regular DOM elements like divs and h1s, or it may render additional custom components like we see in this button. So, for example, a really simple app which has the following components, just represented by rectangles for now. In this tree, this top component represents a top-level component, for example, our app component in a system set up like this. And the lines indicate that this top component is rendering these other components. In some cases, that component may just render regular DOM elements like divs and h1s, or it may render additional custom components like we see in this box where it's rendering two other components. I didn't put any names on here because that's not that terribly important. The point is that there is a parent-child relationship between these components. Let's imagine on one of these bottom-level components we initialize some state, and then we find that a sibling
So it's not inheritance, it's basically one thing inside other.
component, in other words, a component that is also rendered by the same parent, is in need of some of the data that lives in the other component's state. Well, what exactly can we component, in other words, a chip between these components? Let's imagine on one of these bottom level components we initialize some state. And then we find that a sibling component, in other words, a component that is also rendered by the same parent, is in need of some of the data that lives in the other component's state. Well, what exactly can we do then? Think for a second, is there a way for us to pass that state to a sibling component? It turns out that no, this is not possible. And that's because if you look in the file of a component that has a sibling component, it has no reference or knowledge about a sibling component on its own. If we look in our code here, we have an app component that is rendering a header component and a body component. But if we were to go into, let's say, the header component, we see that I've initialized some state here. I can open up this preview so you see what we're working with. And it's using that state. But then if a sibling component like the body needs access to that state, well, the header has no idea that body even exists. Only its immediate parent, app, is the component that knows that both of these components exist. So think for a second, what is it that we need to do if we're facing a situation like this? Well, what if we took our state in this child component and we raised it up into the parent component? Now that it's up in the parent component, do we have a way in React to pass data from this parent component to the child components? Yes, we do. That happens through props. So now the parent component is in charge of the state. It passes the necessary state down to the child components that require it, and they can simply consume the state. If that state were ever to change, React will update this component where the state changed, and it will also update any children components as well. And so therefore, if that state changes that's being passed through props, the child component can update as well. As your application gets more and more complex, you will find yourself having another component that sometimes needs access to that state as well. And just like before, there's no way for us to pass the state or any kind of data from one sibling component to another component, but it's also important to note that there also is no way to pass data upwards in React. This child component has no idea that this other, I guess you could say, uncle or aunt component exists, and therefore there's no way to pass data that way either. So this brings us back to the same solution we had before. We simply raise state up a level, and we pass more props downward. Now, over time, this can get pretty tedious, especially if your state ends up raising up multiple levels above the component that needs it, in which case React does offer a solution to this called context. There's also third-party state management systems like Redux that can help solve this problem. However, both of those are beyond the scope of this course, and we are just going to be sticking with regular state and props for now. So that leads me to a challenge. I want you to take the state that currently exists only within the header and raise it up a level into the app component, and then pass it back down through props to both the header and the body. Then in the body, now that it's receiving the state from above, replace this underline with the state, which is the name of the user. Pause the screencast now and work on this challenge. To raise the state up, we'll simply take this line where we're initializing our state, we'll move it into our app component, and then I will pass those props down. In this case, it's a very simple state of just a string Joe, so we will create a prop, we'll just call it user, and we'll set that equal to our user state variable here. Then in both the body and the header, we need to accept props, and we'll display props.user into the header, props.user. Clean up this challenge, refresh, and there we go. Now if I go to my app and I initialize my state differently, say Bob, and it updates in both places. Understanding that this is the way data flows in React can be, and I initialize my state differently, say Bob, and it updates in both places. Understanding that this is the way data flows in React can be really crucial in helping you architect your application in a way that you can share state amongst only the components that need it. And in fact, that's an important distinction to make at this point. It wouldn't be a great idea to initialize state way up near the top of your component if you don't have components along the entire tree that need it. And there we go. Now if I go to my app and I initialize my state differently, say Bob, and good, it updates in both places. Understanding that this is the way data flows in React can be really crucial in helping you architect your application in a way that you can share state amongst only the components that need it. And in fact, that's an important distinction to make at this point. It wouldn't be a great idea to initialize state way up near the top of your component if you don't have components along the entire tree that need it. Now, I'm not saying that every component needs to have access to that state for it to work, but if this component down here is the only one that needs state, there's no reason for me to put state in its parent or its grandparent and then pass stuff down through props. As a rule of thumb, keep state as local as you can, or in other words, keep it as closely tied to the component or components that need it as you possibly can. With this under our belts, I think it's about time for us to jump in and do a round of challenges to really exercise what you've learned up until this point, and we will start that in the next screencast. This is the beginning of a series of small challenges to really reinforce some of the past topics that we've been learning about. The first thing I want you to do is to take a look at boxes.js. You'll see I created an array of objects which have two properties, ID and on. And your first challenge is to initialize some state inside of our app component. Created a series of small challenges to really reinforce some of the past topics that we've been learning about. The first thing I want you to do is to take a look at boxes.js. You'll see I created an array of objects which have two properties, ID and on. And your first challenge is to initialize some state inside of our app component with the default value being this boxes array. And then I want you to map over that state array and display each one as just an empty square on the screen with a black border and a transparent background color. I don't think you necessarily have to set it as transparent. I think it'll just be transparent by default. For now, don't worry about using the on property at all, although you probably will want to use the ID property, and I'll let you figure out why. If you're using something like a div, don't forget to set a height and a width in the style on it. Ultimately, the goal is to make it so that if the box is set to on or on as true, then the box will be filled in with a color, and in the end, we'll make it so that clicking the box will flip its on value from true to false or false to true. But for now, let's just get some boxes displaying on the page, pause the screencast, and work on this first part of the challenge. We'll start by initializing some state. So I'll say, I don't know, maybe for now we'll just call them squares. And by convention, we'll say set squares. That's going to be from React.use state, and we'll pull in the boxes as the initial value. Then we need to map over the boxes. I'll save my array of elements. I'll maybe call it square elements. And that's going to be squares.map. For each square that we're looking at, I want to return a div. You notice here that I'm using parentheses instead of curly braces. That's simply allowing that we're looking at. I want to return a div. You notice here that I'm using parentheses instead of curly braces. That's simply allowing me to use the implicit return to return the element, and I'm just moving it onto its own line so it doesn't go too far to the left and right. We'll give this div a class name, let's call it box. And actually, this is the class name, so it can just be the string box. I also know because I'm mapping, I'm going to run into that issue where I need to provide a key. In this case, I can use the ID property that's coming from each of these objects. Let's display our square elements, and then we'll go into the style so that it will actually show up. Or rather, I should say, let's render our square elements. I don't think they are going to look like anything on the screen. Yeah, it's just empty. Over in our style, we'll set a stack. And then maybe just so we'll give it a height, maybe we'll do 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. Give it a border. It's black. And then maybe just so we can see everything, I'll put these into a really simple grid just so that I can put them side by side a little better. Actually, I might not even bother with that. Let me give these a display of inline block, and I'll just put a little bit of margin right on them. Honestly, this is going to be good enough for right now. And awesome. Okay, the main things that I wanted you to take away were to practice them. Give it a
How
border.
did he do that?
It's black. And then maybe just so we can see everything, I'll put these into a really simple grid, just put a little bit of margin right on them. Honestly, this is going to be good enough for right now. And awesome. Okay, the main things that I wanted you to take away were to practice setting state or initializing some state, and also practicing the .map method to create an array of elements that we can display on the page, as well as reminding you about this key property. If I take this out, I'm going to get that warning that React always gives if you use a .map to create elements but forget to add a key problem. So I will put that back in. Awesome work. On the next cast, let's do the next part of this challenge.
Dynamic style. To be honest, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Before we can do the next challenge, we need to learn about the style prop. You might be familiar with the concept that in HTML, I can add an attribute called style, and in here, I can insert CSS code. For example, I could give my div with the ID of root, or actually, you know what, let's do this on the body. I could add a style and say the background color is black. Hit refresh, and sure enough, my entire background color becomes black. Just like I can do this in HTML, I can do the exact same thing in React. However, because it's React and it's JavaScript, I can change the style dynamically depending on, for example, the value of our state or the value of incoming props on a component. Let me refresh this so we get our boxes back. And actually, I think I might just add a tiny bit of border radius to those boxes. Okay, to add dynamic style, I can add a style prop to my div, and I think I might, for example, add a tiny bit of border radius the same way we did in HTML. Instead, I'm going to provide an object. Now, here's something that really confused me the first few times I saw it. This set of curly braces does not.